realize.
Hi, good morning. This is Senate Judiciary. This is Wednesday, the 28th day of February, 2024. And we're taking up S-259, an act relating to climate change cost recovery. Our first witness is Julie Moore, the Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources, who will be speaking about a number of changes, potential changes to the bill.
Thank you, Senator Sears. I'm just trying to log into the Zoom so I can share my screen for folks not in the room. Sure, what's going on?
Do you need me to resend it, everybody?
No, I've got the link and it is considering its options at the moment.
Okay.
You want to post them?
Yeah, did you send me the slideshows?
I believe Marion sent
last
them
night.
Which one is the first one?
The one without my name attached.
Okay.
Oh, it claims I'm connecting now, so.
Oh, yeah, there you are. In 1 second.
Right. And you'll make me a co-host?
Yep, as soon as you join.
Okay.
There we go. All right, if you just hit that share button, you'll get it.
Okay, great, thank you.
And the committee does have hard copies of the presentation to follow along with.
So good morning. For the record, I'm Julie Moore. I'm the Secretary of Natural Resources, and I am joined this morning by Marion Wolz, who is the lead resilience efforts in our Climate Action Office in the agency. I thought I could take a few minutes to sort of identify, provide some additional feedback on the bill based on the testimony I'd offered a couple weeks ago, and then Marion can specifically speak to the resilience implementation strategy that we are in the process of working on with the Treasurer's Office. So the current order of operations outlined in S-259 has the Treasurer determining cost to Vermont of covered greenhouse gas emissions. It looks like this work is both retrospective, thinking about costs that have already been incurred as a result of climate change, as well as prospective, estimating future costs to Vermont and becoming resilient to our changing climate. Then it would have ANR adopt rules for the attribution science and cost recovery and assign liabilities to fossil fuel producers. And then we would develop a statewide climate change adaptation master plan that would guide dispersal of any recovered funds. I wanted to offer a possible alternative to that order of operations that would take advantage of the resilience implementation strategy that we are in the process of working on. The bill itself provides a definition of climate change adaptive infrastructure projects, and I think that actually aligns really well with what the resilience implementation strategy is intended to identify. And so the alternative proposal I would bring to you all is that we would start with the resilience implementation strategy, that ANR would scope those projects. The Treasurer could then determine the cost associated with those projects. Following that, ANR could look at emissions factors and fuel volumes, or in parallel, and I would just own that we don't necessarily have the staff resources currently to do that work in parallel, but we can have that conversation too. And then that the Treasurer and ANR would look to allocate those costs. And ultimately, should we cost recover, it would support a grant program that could fund the implementation of the resilience strategy. So happy to answer questions about that, but having spent some time with the bill and thinking about it, feel that this alternative order of operations would go a long ways towards aligning with our current work plan, as well as some of the things.
You would envision the bill incorporating the resilience implementation strategy and go there.
Correct.
I'm assuming that the administration will be supportive of that.
Yes, I mean, the governor and the treasurer together have announced the intention for this resilience implementation strategy. So yes, we're doing that work as we speak, and do think it would.
No reason to duplicate the same,
Correct.
basically the same.
Correct.
I've read over this strategy this morning, and I know two things that I don't know if you're ready to turn it over.
I've got just a couple more slides
Well,
of other.
I'll let you get finished with that, because I wanted to point out two things that are in your slides that are important for us to keep in mind.
Great, yeah, and I'm hopeful there's that opportunity for back and forth. Obviously, the resilience implementation strategy effort is really getting spun up now, and if there are ways to help align it with what's envisioned in this bill, as well as the needs we have under the
That'll be
climate
the
office.
goal of our ledge council, to try to work with the administration and the treasurer to incorporate both together.
That'd be great.
And not try to duplicate anything.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
No, go ahead. I did, but I do want to, if you don't get to Senator,
Oh, no.
if you don't get to them, I'll point to them.
Okay, yeah, and when Marion walks through the resilience implementation strategy too. Just other areas that I think could be useful for clarification as we're working with Ledge Council. I think that there may be reason to consider expanding the definition that's currently being offered for climate change adaptive infrastructure projects. There were a couple of things that jumped out as important from ANR's perspective, and there may be other pieces that are important from other agencies, but buyouts of flood-prone properties, and then looking specifically at conserving connecting wildlife.
When you say buyouts, you mean like buying the Department of Motor Vehicles building and moving it up the hill?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And we've been doing some of
Not
that.
that we're doing that.
We've been doing some of this work through the Flood Resilient Communities Fund. There's always FEMA funding available. It's often imperfect. We've been matching it with ARPA dollars and more recently some state dollars, but I think considering it as part of what's needed in this universe is going to be important.
Okay.
Talking a little bit about the covered period and why these 20, oops, I put 1213 instead of 1231, but why these 20 years, and I expect there's need for a reasonable boundary, but it also feels as if climate change both certainly precedes the year 2000 and certainly have seen some significant effects in the last 4
Sure
or
about
5.
that. We had last week I asked people if they had changes, and we did get a proposal to go to the end of 2022 or 2020, date ending in 2023, the covered period.
Yeah, something like that would make a lot of sense, I think, from my perspective. A few questions around emissions factors and fuel volumes, perhaps some additional clarity around what the liability is being assigned for. Is it the total volume of fuel extracted, produced, and refined worldwide, or that which was delivered for final sale and consumption of Vermont? I think source of volume data and checking with technical staff at ANR, they are aware of a couple of potential data sources, but also flagged that this was an area of challenge when we were looking at the TCI program, the Transportation Climate Initiative program, was identifying the volume data source. And so just noting that this is going to be an area that requires additional work from our perspective.
Senator,
just to emphasize what you just brought up, I fully and 100% agree that making sure we make this very clear regarding whether the liability is being assigned for what's being extracted worldwide versus what's happening in our state. In my opinion, making sure that we stay within our borders is one of the top priorities. And I think that'll also tie into your second point, which is the data source and methodology that you would be using. So just voicing my agreement with that. So thank you for highlighting it.
Yep,
well,
thank you.
you know, and I think back to, I'm gonna date myself here. If y'all remember, acid rain came from Ohio and other states, and it destroyed forests in Vermont. So where do you put the blame? It wasn't Vermont emissions, it was Ohio, or, I'm gonna say Ohio, just easier. But I remember going up to the Algonquin in Ontario, Canada, and seeing the impact of that on the forests in that area and how bad it was. And so I just think, you know, when we do this, I think we have to look at the worldwide volume, but the impact on Vermont.
Yes. Understood. Yeah, I think just the clarity, I guess I'm not in a position to yet offer.
I think we have to make it clear that it's the
but-
volume that has been dispersed, and then its impact on Vermont is seen by the, whatever you want, the resiliency strategy dollars that are needed to make Vermont again. And I think acid rain is probably a great example, because it was, you know, our first real sign of the impact of fossil fuels on the environment.
Yeah, and very little we can do directly.
Yeah, we couldn't stop Ohio
Correct.
or Kentucky or wherever it was coming from.
You know, I think you have a really good point, and I absolutely respect your desire for that clarity. And what we know is climate change isn't going to respect the borders of our state.
No.
It's going to impact us in whatever way it's going to impact us. So I think we do need clarity, but we also need to sort of like consider the scope of the issue and the impacts that it is having within our borders, recognizing that, like Senator Sears said, it may not be what we are doing. It is likely what's happening worldwide, but the impacts within our borders are very real.
How come we never talk about acid rain?
Because it's largely been addressed.
Yeah.
There's been technology.
So-
We have an acid lakes program at A&R
Yeah.
where we continue to collect data samples, as we have for the better part of 40 years now, to
Right.
look at
Yeah.
trends. And they're generally
It's
improving.
sort of like polio, until we see it again, we don't,
Correct.
we forget.
Yes.
Anyway, please go ahead.
No worries. Couple other areas of where potential clarification could be useful around the liability calculations. To be frank, struggled to sort of make complete sense of the calculation that's in there. Depending on where you end up landing in timeline might suggest to have the agency go off and come back with a recommendation regarding the liability calculation.
Mhm.
And then finally, the rulemaking piece, there's a little bit of tension, I guess, or redundancy inherent in the way 259 is drafted. It has a shall and a list of things the agency would be required to engage in rulemaking around. Some of those things are already brought into statute in the bill. One simple way to address it would just be to use may instead of shall and give the agency the ability to do rulemaking in this space. And I think it probably, again, going back to the resilience implementation strategy, depending on how you choose to proceed, it may make sense to consider the opportunity to adopt the resilience implementation strategy as full.
And in the rulemaking process, you'd be relying on, if it goes to May, you'd be relying on the treasurer for some of the information.
Correct. I think there are components of what's listed in 599A right now that are required by statute.
Have there been any discussions with the Attorney General on the resilience strategy?
I have not spoken to the Attorney General about it.
We should probably just check to make sure she doesn't want to talk, or if she wants to. If the Attorney General would like to weigh in.
Attorney General will be here today.
Schedule.
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah.
oh, God. See, one thing I didn't do was read the agenda. All right. Oh, you caught me. You see, she's on the agenda. Good.
Make a reset to that.
All right, well, you know, it's a little embarrassing sometimes. I read all your slides and I forgot to read the agenda.
You can only do so much, Senator.
All right, so.
And then just a note about resources required. Our current timeline has us working with the treasurer's office to complete the resilience implementation strategy by July 1st of next year. That timing was picked because it matches when a revised climate action plan will be adopted by the Climate Council. So felt it made sense to have those two efforts move forward in lockstep. And just would flag for you the same thing I've flagged repeatedly in our policy committees, is that our capacity as an agency is exhausted, other than the commitments we've already made between a lot of these federal funding initiatives and then other programmatic initiatives that are underway. And so to the extent there's a desire to move faster or do more, we would need to understand your expectations and come back with a resource request.
Okay, the one thing the caveat I'll put in, and I don't know how to do that, but may need help from the Attorney General and Treasurer and others, is if we need extra help, extra staff for A&R to do the job, we should be able to do that with monies that would come back to Vermont to cover the costs of the recovery. And I know that in the court process, that can be part of the recovery. So I don't know how to, hopefully Mike O'Grady and the Ledge Council can work with joint fiscal on some of that language to make sure if you need technical expertise outside of the agency, that you'll be able to build that to the climate resiliency.
Yeah, that would be excellent, because we would need either contracted or staff support beyond what we currently have. And with that, I can stop sharing and have Marion turn the seat over to Marion and let her walk you through a little bit more on the resilience implementation strategy.
Thank you, and I'm encouraged by the resilience implementation strategy and what you, it seems to fit with what we're trying to do here.
I agree. Excellent. Thank you.
Just to point out to the committee, this is still a strict liability bill, and while I hope the Natural Resources Committee will take a look at it, it really is about liability and it's about judiciary. It's not necessarily. Okay.
Sorry for the speaking. Morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for having me today. My name is Marion Woles. I'm the Resilience and Adaptation Coordinator in A&R's Climate Action Office, and here to speak to you today about the Resilience Implementation Strategy, which we think complements quite well what you're looking for in the bill here. On January 3rd of this year, if you haven't seen, there's information on our website about it, but the Governor and Treasurer Pichek kicked off the development of a Resilience Implementation Strategy. This initiative is intended to integrate existing work from across state government into a comprehensive strategy that will guide and prioritize climate resilience efforts. Integrating this work is ever more important, I think you all know, in the face of increased and more severe climate-related natural hazards, such as flooding from this summer and winter, early droughts, increased freeze-thaw cycles, poor air quality due to wildfires to our north. We see near-term alignment of this work through bodies like the Climate Action Office, as well as the State Treasurer's Office, to maximize the delivery of the resilience programs we already have, and maybe change some of those in scale and scope to ensure they're delivered effectively to Vermonters. The Resilience Implementation Strategy, as Secretary Moore noted, will be developed in parallel and in complement to the next iteration of the Climate Action Plan, with both being due on July 1st, 2025. I'll get more to intended outcomes with this in a moment, but at a high level, we intend the strategy to assess existing state programs, policies, and plans, incorporate stakeholder engagement, and ultimately recommend criteria for allocating state support for resilience projects and approaches for funding implementation efforts on an ongoing basis. As I've noted, this strategy will build off a lot of existing work and programs, some of which you see listed at the bottom of the slide here. I won't read all of these bullets, but we'll note these examples do lean heavily towards those that increase resilience to flooding impacts, but the resilience implementation strategy is intended to take an all hazards approach to the assessment and recommendations included therein. So there are other programs and areas we'll be looking at that cover drought, wildfire risk, both the chronic and acute impacts of climate change that we're feeling in the state. Before I get into key priorities and high-level work plan, I did want to touch on some recommendations, the recommendations for increasing resilience to climate change that are included in the current climate action plan that are directly referenced in section 599 of the bill, and why we see the resilience implementation strategy as a complement to that, particularly as it relates to climate resilience. So the climate action plan, I think you all know, was adopted by the Climate Council on December 1st of 2021. It includes pathways, strategies, and actions that consider greenhouse gas reductions, help communities prepare for the impacts of climate change, and consider opportunities for carbon sequestration. Both the Climate Action Plan and the Resilience Implementation Strategy are and will be multi-stakeholder efforts, but the current Climate Action Plan does not include specific implementation details that I think are really important for what you're looking for in implementation of this work. Things like implementing partner, timeframe, funding sources, and needs are not currently called out in the Climate Action Plan. The Climate Action Plan also, it does a high-level prioritization, but doesn't prioritize into more depth across the two resilience pathways that you reference in the S259 language. The CAP also does not detail specific climate change adaptation infrastructure projects that I think are called out in this bill as well. And while it does include a wide range of recommended actions that address, again, not only those acute but chronic climate change risks, as well as the cascading impacts of climate change, that lack of implementation detail will make it challenging to prioritize funding based on those pathways alone. So we see the resilience implementation strategy as really complementary to this work, drawing both from the existing climate action plan, the work the Climate Council will be putting in with support from ANR into developing the next CAP, as well as also pulling in other, again, state plans, programs, and policies for a more comprehensive opportunity assessment that will result in a gap analysis and then a prioritized set of interventions. I think the other key piece I wanted to highlight here is what you all are looking for is really a financial assessment of the costs associated with implementation of adaptation actions. I think that's really a key component to understanding our investment needs, to prioritize state support for projects, and then the ability to also track our progress over time. And that's something that, with support of the Treasurer, we intend to include in that resilience implementation strategy.
So I understand.
Sure.
I'm getting the flavor of what it does not include, but it is a strategy to deal with the climate change, and whatever is included in that strategy is going to be either up to the landowner or the taxpayer if we can't recoup losses from, can't recoup the cost from the folks who did the damage. And so that's how I see them working together. It's not necessarily that I know, I understand what you're saying, but somebody's going to have to pay to buy out a landowner. Somebody's going to have to pay to give an interest-free loan to a small business struggling with being in a floodplain. So all of that's going to have to happen, and that's where I think the cost recovery comes in determining what's the cost to the state of Vermont and its inhabitants. And so I think they do fit together, even though it says it doesn't, it does.
No, absolutely. And I don't mean to imply they do fit together, and that's our intent, is they're really complementary efforts. And I think what you're speaking to, really looking at what are those financing and cost recovery aspects that really support our ability to adapt to climate change? Is it, what's sort of the state share for tying for match? What is intended to be covered through low interest or no cost loans? Those types of considerations are what we intend to include in the resilience implementation strategy and work closely with the Treasurer on as well.
Going back to the basic tenet of the bill, it's rather simple.
Right.
Who's paying the bill?
Yeah. Right. And we know that, these impacts of climate change, unlike sort of the broad, no boundaries scope of greenhouse gas emissions, the impacts of climate change are felt really locally and are felt at that individual homeowner, renter, municipal level, the flooding impacts, the impacts of other climate change disasters. So
I remember after Irene trying to get to Wilmington, which I represent, I had to go down through Massachusetts, detour through several Massachusetts roads in the northern Berkshires, and then get to Wilmington and just see the devastation there from the flooding that, you know, even I'll never forget going by the local fire department and seeing all the equipment outside trying to dry it off because the fire station got flooded.
Right.
As well as the police station.
Yeah.
I did just, those things stick in your mind
Yeah.
as to what the loss was.
Yeah, the scale is sometimes unimaginable. So getting to sort of the key components that were included in the unveiling of the resilience implementation strategy and where we're hoping to prioritize work, looking both at what work exists, where there are gaps, and then how do we prioritize interventions. I'll go through these 5 key components quickly, but we'll note they're sort of woven in throughout the work plan that I'll get to in a moment. So at a high level, the strategy will place communities at the forefront, recognizing that local perspectives are needed and are integral to ensuring effective climate resilience. We're intending to center community engagement that's in line with Vermont's environmental justice law and empower residents to actively participate. We see a community-centered approach as an overarching core component of this strategy to help shape the identification of gaps and priorities. We're currently working to develop an engagement plan together with our Environmental Justice Office at A&R for this effort, and are aiming to kick off engagement efforts later this spring and early summer for this work. For nature-based solutions, I think you all are aware of what this means, but we're prioritizing nature-based solutions projects that really lessen the impacts of extreme weather on agriculture, forestry, and water resources. We know these solutions serve to both buffer the state's infrastructure and built environment from the most impacts of climate change, and also support our natural communities. So that's an important core component of this strategy and an assessment of gaps and need interventions in this space. We have a considerable amount of infrastructure in Vermont that's vulnerable to climate change impacts. Senator, you were just speaking to some of those impacts you saw after Irene. The strategy will seek to recommend how to harden Vermont's critical assets to better withstand extreme weather events. On the emergency management side, with warning and effective response systems, we know these are critical to ensuring Vermont's safety to all hazards. This strategy will look at and identify policies needed to support fast, effective response and early warning systems. These tools will enable Vermonters to anticipate and respond swiftly to climate change related threats, overall reducing impacts on communities and our infrastructure. And lastly, for economic and environmental sustainability, the strategy seeks to really acknowledge the interconnectedness of this climate resilience and economic stability in our state. We're looking to include initiatives that support businesses and working lands enterprises in adapting to climate change impacts. So the Climate Action Office is supporting this work and has worked closely with the Secretary and the Treasurer to put together a high-level work plan. Many of the core components of the strategy will be integrated through a series of efforts that build off work that's been completed to date or is planned across state government. So I'll go through at a high level the priorities, and then the last slide is sort of a summation of that work. Near term, intending to sort of be the first step of this resilience implementation strategy taking place starting now, but summer into fall of this year. We plan to undertake something we're calling an opportunity assessment, intended to really be an inventory and gap assessment of state plans, programs, policies, and funding mechanisms that already exist in state government that touch or have co-benefits for climate resilience. I think we know a lot of this work exists in state government. You'll hear Secretary Moore talk about clean water programs. There's really the primary benefits for clean water initiatives, but co-benefits when it comes to climate resilience. And I think really doing an assessment and understanding where we're doing this work in state government and also cataloging where there are gaps will help us then prioritize interventions to fill those gaps and ultimately understand where the costs are located. We'll also be compiling any climate vulnerability assessments across economic, infrastructure, and natural community sectors to get a better understanding of our exposure and risk. So we then know how we can prioritize interventions to mitigate or adapt to the impacts of climate change. I think understanding where we have it, where modeling helps us better understand our climate vulnerabilities moving into the future for, again, our infrastructure, economic, and natural community sectors is going to be important as we start to plan for and think about the costs associated with future mitigation actions. And through this opportunity assessment, we also plan to identify gaps that align with high-level definition and vision for climate resilience that we want to do together with Vermonters through a public engagement process. And so that's where you see really defining what climate resilience means for Vermonters, and tying that to the rollout of this strategy. In the medium term, we'll be working to identify metrics to track progress on resilience efforts, which is key to ensuring we understand the impacts of the investments we're having to address climate change impacts. We'll also be categorizing those gaps that were illuminated through this opportunity assessment across these various sectors, and then again using community engagement, look at a vision for climate resilience, and think about how we can then prioritize those gaps. And in the long term, meaning not super long term, but by summer of 2025, as the intent for the strategy is to have a final complete strategy by July 1st of 2025. It's really, the priority there is to understand the policy needs and costs associated with filling gaps for climate resilience based on the priorities we've set, and then identify the mechanisms to fill those gaps. I think it's important to note again that a lot of this work needed to build climate resilience exists in state government, or exists across the state, but changes may be needed to the pace, scale, and scope of existing programs. So that will be included in sort of the program and policy recommendations, and what you see noted on the slide.
Do you have, one of the problems post-Irene and that many communities faced was requirements from the feds that we couldn't do all we should have done. And I think Bennington was a good example. They did more than they should have done on the Walloomsac River. But then during the recent flooding this year, the water got up to I live near the Silk Road Bridge. The water was just underneath the bridge, but it never rose over the bridge. And I think it was because of the work that wasn't approved that they did there. Do we have any way to make sure that as we're planning this resilience strategy, we can go beyond the minimums that the feds are talking about? I think that's really critical. And I think probably the best example is that Walloomsac River and the bridge. There was certainly serious flooding around it, but didn't go over its banks.
I think there are a couple of pieces under yours. One is in areas that we put in place more tools since Tropical Storm Irene for areas that we know are particularly dynamic, and this area, I think it's the Walloomsac or the Roaring Branch there.
Well, yeah, it's a combination of the two.
Is one that we have a standing agreement with the town in terms of maintenance and ensuring that the sediment and rocks don't aggregate to a level that they would flood the bridge. Yeah. So there's active intervention there. We've also, as an agency, engaged with FEMA and secured, I think it's still an only in the nation agreement, where they now work with us to replace bridges and culverts that are damaged during a flood event, not in kind, but with what the structure should be sized for in the face of our changing climate. And frankly, in this summer's flood event, lost, to my knowledge, only one structure that's been replaced to those modern sizing standards, and it wasn't because it was too much water, it was because of a debris jam. So ongoing maintenance is going to be a thing, but I believe we have much better tools now than we had during Irene, and frankly, they really proved their merit during the summer's flood events.
Appreciate that.
Yeah. And to add on to that too, I think Secretary Moore mentioned the Flood Resilient Communities Fund, which is run through Vermont Emergency Management, but is intended to be a program that allows for sort of those projects that don't fit into the FEMA, square buckets. So allows a little bit more flexibility, and I think gets to your question too of, are we only looking at what FEMA requires? Yes, no, I think we're expanding and already are looking at how we as a state can support some of these more creative solutions, at least in FEMA's mind. So I'll just wrap up on this slide here, and then I can hand it over to the treasurer. Happy to answer questions. I think to sum it up again, a lot of the work planned for the resilience implementation strategy builds off of existing work or planned work we already had in the Climate Action Office. We're a fairly new office, so have a lot of initiatives underway that we're sort of moving forward in the resilience space. But again, really see this as a collaborative effort with Vermonters to really take a look at what we're already doing to build resilience to climate change, put it into a comprehensive strategy, and then understand sort of the risks, costs, and then interventions needed to support that. And I think tying this in with the work you all are looking at makes a lot of sense to me. So I think with that, I'm happy to answer questions, or I can hand it over to the Treasurer's Office.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions? And thanks to the Agency on Natural Resources. We look forward to working with you on this bill.
I do.
Senator?
Yeah, I appreciate that you're working with the environmental justice, I think you said it was an office on this. One of the things I want to make sure that we do in this bill is really center environmental justice and responding to the communities that are most impacted. Is there someone in that office or on the, I think there's a board too, that would be good to come in and sort of look over this bill with us to help us do that?
I think Carla Ramundi, who's the director of the Environmental Justice Office at ANR, and who really helps lead that effort with the boards, the interagency boards there, would be great. And we've met with Carla to talk about the resilience implementation strategy in particular, and how we can ensure that that is centering those communities and is. We're doing work already, community engagement work in the Climate Action Office. We're doing a series of focus groups with marginalized and non-English speaking groups right now over the past couple of weeks to really talk about climate change, introduce the office and introduce the work we're doing, and hope that that will help build into the resilience implementation strategy work and others. But I think Carla would be great to come and speak to this.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay. Treasurer Michael Kuchek, who is with us remotely, which is fine, and appreciate that, Mike. And please go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you very much.
We need another chair.
I
Or you
have
can
to-
stay in that chair.
Well, I have to step out anyway, so
Oh,
I'll just
okay.
give it a couple minutes early to not disrupt.
We're trying to get the room
and to create a seat.
cleaned up.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Chair Sears.
State House today, Mike. It's extremely hot here. The heat is working well. Speaking of climate resiliency, the heat is overworking itself because it's warmer than it's supposed to be in February.
60 degrees.
And it's 60 degrees, and so it's about 80 in this room.
Well, it's nice to be with you all here, even if I'm not in the room. The sauna, I should say, I guess, with you all.
Good. Well, please go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, well, just excited to reiterate the parts that we heard today from. Say it again.
I should call you Mr. Treasurer and not Mike.
Oh, no, Mike is great. To reiterate the points made by ANR this morning, we had worked on a climate report over the summer that the legislature asked us to look at relative to the opportunities that are available under the IRA and the Transportation Act at the federal level for Vermont to try to pull down as much federal money as possible in the area of climate action. And, we started that work before July and the July flooding. And, once the flooding occurred, obviously our focus was also tied to resiliency. And a couple of things to note when we finished that work, we were excited about some recommendations we had relative to climate financing for weatherization and electrification and green energy production, both opportunities that are under the IRA and better opportunities to collaborate and use funds that are available in the public and private sector to work on those three things. But with resiliency, it was a tougher challenge. There wasn't as much money available at the federal level. It does not appear focused on resiliency under the IRA. It's really focused on greenhouse gas reduction. We couldn't figure out good ways to finance a lot of the infrastructure that needs to happen with resiliency, because those are, you're talking about funding, not financing with resiliency. You need money, you need grants to do these projects. There's not a revenue stream that gets created that you can help finance a project. So we were really excited when we were approached by ANR about this opportunity to partner with the administration to think about resiliency, because that was something we were really having a challenge with our report. And I think it's important to think of resiliency in connection with the work that's going on greenhouse gas reduction as well, because we know no matter how much progress we make in our state and even across the country and across the globe, we're already seeing the impacts of climate change. So we're going to have a robust response in terms of resiliency as well. I guess that's also another reason why the bill is of interest to me as well, because as I said, a lot of that infrastructure improvement will need to come from a funding source, not necessarily a financing mechanism. So where do those funds come from to make those important investments? And the bill that you're considering, I think, is one that partly answers that question in terms of making sure individual industries that had driven the cost increases are helping pay for some of the investments that need to be made in order to avoid those worst impacts. So I'm excited about our resiliency work with ANR. We're looking forward. We've already started that work, but I think we'll start in earnest once the session has completed and we have a little bit more focus in our agencies, and looking forward to coming up with that plan, and I think identifying ways to prioritize, to collaborate, additional resources that need to be brought to the table to make those long-term investments. But again, back to the bill, the work that our office is asked to do, this is something that we have some experience in, at least I have some experience in. When I was at the Department of Financial Regulation, we commissioned a study while I was there looking at the impacts of climate change on the insurance industry. We were really interested in how has the insurance industry changed, and then how will it likely change into the future as a result of a climate that's warmer and wetter. So we went about that work by hiring a meteorologist who is an expert in climate science. And we got 10 years worth of insurance claims from our major carriers in Vermont. We matched that up to weather events that had occurred over the past decade. And then we forecasted out over the next 30 years, what kind of events will we see? And then how will that impact our insurance industry, and what kind of costs will there be for both the companies and policyholders as well? So I view that work as sort of a part of what's being asked for here in our office, to try to come up with a calculation as to the impacts, not just on the insurance industry, but more broadly, people that don't have insurance, on municipalities, on government, in the agricultural sector, and housing, and the like. So it's something that I'd be excited to engage in. I see Senator
Wahowski has a question.
Yeah, thanks, Treasurer Paycheck. So when you did that forecasting, like using insurance, what we're seeing is a lot of insurers are less and less likely to insure in certain areas, or the insurance policies are rising to the point where people can't actually afford them. So did it take into account the fact that actually people are less likely in the future to even be able to access that type of insurance, and the increased costs on the individual?
Yeah, so that report was looking at the insurance industry. I think the work that we would be asked to do under this bill would have to take into account exactly what you're talking about, for a couple of reasons. Both for the fact that people, it's harder to get insurance, it's less affordable. We're hearing that across the board, across the country. But even with our work that we did looking at the last decade and then looking forward, there are a lot of people that don't have insurance in Vermont, particularly when it comes to flood insurance. I think we have like 3,000 flood policies in effect in Vermont, and well in excess of hundreds of thousands of units of housing and other structures in our state. So just a small percentage of Vermonters have flood insurance. So if we're looking at the cost to Vermont from the impacts of climate change, looking just at insurance will only be a subset of the total cost to Vermonters and our state.
Perfect. Thank you. That was sort of the point I was driving at, is if we're only looking at insurance, we're actually going to not capture a huge sector of people being impacted. So thanks for helping me understand how you plan to sort of do that work going forward to make sure that we're getting the people who can't afford insurance and are going to be impacted.
Even if they do have insurance, the experience in Fort Myers, Florida is instructive as to how the insurance companies have treated people that were insured by lowballing their claims. And even when adjusters have said this is what the fair value would be, the insurance companies have refused the adjusters. So I think there's a perfect example of how that is also impacting citizens, even if they do have insurance. And the whole, nobody wants to pay, I guess, but they want to collect a profit. Well, anyway, you're not with financial regulation, so I can't blame you for the insurance anymore.
Fair enough.
But I think it is instructive, though, to what you will see in the future in terms of Vermonters trying to get insurance for various climate-related catastrophes.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, what we're seeing in Vermont is maybe it's of a different scale, but it's of a similar consequence as to places like Florida or out west, where the insurance industry is really seized up and it's almost impossible to get insurance. And as the senator pointed out, that has a lot of downstream effects. If you're trying to finance a home, you're going to be required to have insurance, and if insurance is unaffordable, it makes buying a home one more thing that makes it more challenging to buy and or do it at all if you can't get insurance. So it's definitely critical to to try to understand how to build resiliency into our communities to try to benefit individual policyholders and make sure that insurance is still around into the future.
So do you have somebody in your office that can work with our ledge council to make sure that we're not duplicating your work in the climate resiliency strategy as well as in this bill?
Yes, absolutely. We'd be happy to do that. Our general counsel, Justin St. James, certainly could
that would be helpful to work out, because I don't want you having to duplicate work or us. I think they should be seen as the two strategies.
And to your point, Chair Sears, that I know the bill asks us to look at costs that have already been incurred by Vermont and Vermonters. And I think that's a component that would be separate from the resiliency work that we're doing, that's sort of looking ahead at what's needed to make those investments. So I think that's a part of the work that we could start that wouldn't be duplicative or need to wait for this broader resiliency plan, for example. So happy to do that, and happy to go into more details about how to best align it with this resiliency strategy.
Questions for the treasurer? Thank you so much, Mike. Appreciate it. Good to see you, and hopefully a week from, not next week, but the week after, we'll have more drafts of this bill to kind of go over and make sure we're in the right place. I don't know what day, but the goal is to get the bill out, and I'm hoping we can do that by crossover deadline.
Great. And we stand ready to help.
Thank you. So is the Attorney General?
So the Attorney General is running slightly late.
Okay.
And we also are running a little ahead, which is always exciting. So
all right.
We can
see if we can take a 10-minute break and be back here at 10, and maybe the Attorney General can be here by then.
I'll reach out to them right now.
And so why don't we go off